So this is the second installment of Jump Right In, and this one has to do with Chapter 2, Sexology Research, History, Methods, and Ethics. But first, just a reminder that you want to make sure you're watching all the Jump Right In videos, because I will cover some information that Dr. Lehmiller doesn't cover in the textbook that you might find on your final exam. Okay, so you may have wondered already in reading a little bit of the textbook so far, okay, how can we make some of these sweeping generalizations that we made about human sexuality? This is a very intimate human experience. So how do we find this stuff out? How does science and psychology and sexology, how do these scientific areas know these things? So sexological research didn't really start in earnest until the mid-20th century. So let's start with Alfred Kinsey, who was a faculty and staff member at Indiana University. He was a researcher as well as a professor. And so basically he kind of started this whole scientific approach to studying human sexuality. So he and his colleagues actually traveled the entire United States and interviewed, surveyed thousands, tens of thousands of Americans to find out what their sexual proclivities, habits, and values were, their sexual orientation and so forth. Now, if Kinsey's ringing a bell at all to you, it's probably in the context of what we call the Kinsey Scale. Now, the Kinsey Scale wasn't put together in a real scientific way, but it is based on a type of research called observation and, of course, through correlational research. So Kinsey and his colleagues said, well, as far as human sexuality is concerned, there's a scale that goes from 0 to 6. And 0 refers to individuals who identify 100% exclusively as heterosexual. You are a Kinsey 6 if you identify 100% exclusively as homosexual. Of course, if you're a 3, then you're probably kind of on the fence between the two. You identify as bisexual, right? So you can express sexual intimacy with males and females. So here's the problem with Kinsey's research, though. He didn't ignore various ethnicities and racial groups, but the problem is that when he published his research, he did not include results he got from those groups, because he said that his information wasn't robust enough, didn't have enough people who were participating. So everybody that his studies were published about were white, Protestant, Christian, at least middle class. The Kinsey Institute still is in existence at Indiana University, still does studies. It's probably more of an educational facility now. I think to help them raise funds for the Kinsey Museum they have there, I think they sell t-shirts that says, I'm a Kinsey, and then the number 0 through 6 is screen printed, and you make that choice when you order the t-shirt. So a little bit of overlap occurs between Alfred Kinsey and also Bill Masters and Virginia Johnson. So they were working in the 1950s and 60s. So Bill Masters was affiliated with Washington University in St. Louis to begin with. He didn't stay there. He had to go from one facility to the next after his studies started going in earnest, because sometimes there were community outcries against what he was doing. Because he and Virginia Johnson, they were taking a very experimental approach to study of human sexuality. They would actually set up rooms that had a one-way window where they could observe into the room where there was some scientific equipment. Lehmiller describes a couple of devices that they use in this chapter to measure arousal and orgasm with females and males. So you would have those kinds of things going on, and there was a bed set up there too. So if you showed up alone, you would be willing to masturbate. If you showed up with a partner, then the two of you would engage in sexual relations. And so a lot of what they observed with that data came to the development of a theory, and that was the theory of the cycles of human sexual response. And then there were 4 cycles that they identified. First was excitement, when you're sexually aroused. And so the excitement continues to grow and grow and grow during sexual activity until it plateaus. So plateaus means this is the peak of sexual excitement before the explosive orgasm. So orgasm will be the 3rd, and then resolution is the 4th cycle. So basically it used to be a joke that, yeah, the resolution is when the 2 people engaged in sexual intimacy would cuddle. But not everybody after sex cuddles. Some people get very hungry. Other people just roll over and go to sleep. They get very sleepy. Bill Masters and Virginia Johnson actually got married later on in their work together, even though Virginia Johnson did not get a doctorate degree or an MD degree during their career. She was just as instrumental in their research as her cohort was. And another big contribution they made to sexuality studies, and particularly to psychology, is that they developed a way of dealing with people who come to psychotherapists with sexual performance problems. Okay, so the third one and most recent one, which I think the first one was in about 2010, is the National Survey on Sexual Health and Behavior. And this also comes out of Indiana University. And so, and I think it's been updated since then. So those are the 3 major investigations that have been done. Now, back to how do we do the study? Okay, how do we get the populations we're going to use, the pool of participants that we're going to use to make generalizations to the general public? So we have convenience and random selection. Convenience samples are, like, for example, Kinsey worked at a university, and if he wanted to do studies, he would just advertise to students, right? And students would volunteer. Okay, so there's a problem with that. Think about it. If you're only getting your data from students at the university, how generalizable does that go across other populations, other developmental periods like middle age, older, adulthood, and so forth? So random selection is a better way of getting a more diverse group of individuals to participate. There's something in the ethics code that you'll notice in reading this chapter that supports the do no harm clause in the APA psychological code, and that is that surveys are probably the best approach. Surveys and interviews are probably the best approach to take if you want to make sure that what you're doing is not potentially harmful. Also, sometimes we expect people to come to us. When people come to us and volunteer for our studies, then they are self-selecting. 2 problems with that. First of all, if a participant in a study self-selects, then that means that they probably already have thought a little bit or considered a little bit about the topic of your study. They may even have already cultivated attitudes or values about it. And the other thing has to do with the fact that it's going to be biased more toward women, because men are not nearly as likely to volunteer for these studies as women are. And of course, then there's direct observation, as we've alluded to when we talked about Bill Masters and Virginia Johnson. Reactivity is something else to keep in mind when we're talking about observational research, because if you're watching somebody, particularly when you're talking about research with human sexuality, if you're watching someone, you're observing somebody, they know you're observing them, might that have some kind of impact on the way they behave? Now, as technology has advanced, in the medical profession specifically, we've been able to move forward a little bit in terms of dealing with the human sexual response, including orgasm, because thermal imaging allows us to see without being so intrusive with some of those devices that Lehmiller describes in the textbook that you attach to female and male genitalia in order to measure degrees of arousal. If you're doing thermal imaging, then basically not nearly as intrusive, because you're seeing about the increases in blood flow. Even better than that, though, is the functional MRIs, which looks at that brain and body connection as far as sexuality is concerned, because we can see what parts of the brain are really, really activated in those scans during sexual arousal, during orgasm, during the resolution phase of sex. Okay, and then the biggest thing to remember about research is that there is a big difference between correlational research and experimental research. Correlational research means that we found a relationship between two variables, but there is nothing that indicates that one variable causes the other. Whereas in experimental research, we find that there's good evidence that one variable causes another variable. In other words, it brings about that result. And finally, with ethics, in 1932, the U.S. government started the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this was done at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And we tracked, or the government tracked, 399 black men who had been diagnosed with syphilis. Well, what's so bad about that? We want to know about sexually transmitted infections, so this is a valid topic, except that we violated ethics big time. We didn't even tell them what the study was about. We didn't even tell them that they had been diagnosed with syphilis. And so from 1932, for 40 years, we tracked the men who had been identified with syphilis. The doctors in that community in Alabama were told not to treat them for syphilis. We would study what was really being studied by the government is the progression of syphilis over a number of years. And so, syphilis can affect the brain. You may have heard, syphilis can make you crazy. Syphilis has been related to destroying parts of the brain and ultimately creating dementia, in addition to destroying other organs in your body. We did not, our government did not apologize until 1997, when during the Clinton administration, President Clinton spoke out in a televised appearance and apologized to the men and to the families of those men who had been identified for this. Okay, so that's it for the second chapter. I hope you enjoy your exploration of the topics that Lehmiller includes in chapter 2.